Yesterday, the Prime Minister spoke about the anguish that the infected blood scandal brought to those impacted by it. I want to reiterate his words and apologise again today. I am sorry. The Prime Minister also spoke, on behalf of the whole House, of our gratitude to Sir Brian Langstaff and his team for completing his comprehensive report. I think 7 volumes, 2,500 pages. And of our appreciation of all those who came forward as part of the inquiry. It was the greatest privilege of my ministerial career to have met over 40 representatives of the infected blood community in Cardiff, Edinburgh, Belfast, Birmingham, and Leeds, as we finalised our response to compensation for this appalling tragedy. The whole community's bravery, through immense suffering, is what has enabled justice today. And I know that many of them will be watching in the gallery. I want to honour their fortitude through their unimaginable pain as I lay out a more detailed response to Sir Brian's second interim report on compensation. We will provide the House with a further opportunity to debate the inquiry's full report after the Whitsun recess. The Government will also respond to each recommendation in full as quickly as possible within its comprehensive response to the report. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister confirmed yesterday that the Government will pay comprehensive compensation to those who have been infected and affected as a result of this scandal. And I will now set out to the House the scheme the Government is proposing. And of course, more details of the scheme will be published online today. We are establishing the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, an arm's-length body to administer the compensation scheme. A shadow body has already been set up and an interim CEO has been appointed. And today, I'm delighted to announce the appointment of Sir Robert Francis as the interim chair of the organisation. The experience and the care that Sir Robert will bring to this role will ensure that the scheme is credible and trusted by the community. His support in delivering this scheme will be invaluable. Mr. Speaker, those who have been infected or affected as a result of this scandal will receive compensation. To be crystal clear, if you have been directly or indirectly infected by NHS blood, blood products, or tissue contaminated with HIV or hepatitis C, or have developed a chronic infection from blood contaminated with hepatitis B, you will be eligible to claim compensation under the scheme. And where an infected person has died, but would have been eligible under these criteria, compensation will be paid to their estate. And this will include where a person was infected with hepatitis B and died during the acute period of infection. But, Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian could not have been clearer. It's not just the harm caused by the infections that requires compensation. It's also the wrong suffered by those affected that must also be compensated for. So when a person with an eligible infection has been accepted onto the scheme, their affected loved ones will be able to apply for compensation in their own right. That means partners, parents, siblings, children and friends and family who have acted as carers of those who are infected are all eligible to claim. Now, I'm aware that being asked to provide evidence of eligibility will likely be distressing, so I'm determined to minimise that as much as possible. And I'm pleased to confirm today that anyone already registered with one of the existing infected blood support schemes will automatically be considered eligible for compensation. Mr. Speaker, I would also like to give thanks to the dedication and hard work of Professor Sir Jonathan Montgomery and the other members of the expert group who were critical in advising on how the government could faithfully translate the recommendations of Sir Brian for the scheme. And in line with our previous commitment, we will publish the names of those experts today. Now, in his report, Sir Brian recommended compensation be awarded with respect to the following 5 categories. An injury impact award, acknowledging the physical and mental injury caused by the infection. A social impact award to address the stigma or social isolation as a result of the infection. An autonomy award, acknowledging how family and private life was disrupted during this time. A care award to compensate for past and future care needs of anyone infected. And finally, a financial loss award for past and future financial losses suffered as a result of the infection. The government accepts this recommendation with 2 small refinements. Informed by the work of the expert group and designed for simplicity and speed, 2 other principles that Sir Brian asserted. First, the care award will be directly awarded to the person with the infection or their estate. And second, the financial loss award will be paid either directly to the person with the infection or where an infected person has tragically died before the establishment of the scheme, their estate and affected persons who were dependent on them. Now, sadly, many people have links to multiple individuals who are infected, or are both infected themselves and affected by another's infection. So multiple injury awards will be offered to reflect the scale of the loss and suffering. The scheme will be tariff-based, and we will be publishing an explanatory document including examples of proposed tariffs on gov.uk. However, Mr. Speaker, this is not the end. Over the next few weeks, Sir Robert Francis will seek views from the infected blood community on the proposed scheme before its terms are set in regulations to make sure that the scheme will best serve those that it's intended for. Now, Sir Robert has welcomed the government's proposals as positive and meaningful, and he will set out more details on engagement with the community shortly. The inquiry recommended that the scheme should be flexible in its awards of compensation, providing both for a lump sum or regular payments. And we agree. And that is why the awards to living infected or affected persons will be offered a lump sum or periodical payments. And where the infected person has died, estate representatives will receive compensation as a single lump sum to then distribute to beneficiaries of the estate as is appropriate. We will also guarantee that any payments made to those eligible will be exempt from income, capital gains, and inheritance tax, as well as disregard from means-tested benefit assessments. And we will also ensure that all claimants are able to appeal their award, both through an internal review process in the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, and where needed, the right to appeal to a first-tier tribunal. And our expectation is that final payments will start before the end of the year. Now, Mr. Speaker, if you would permit, I would like to return to the House when the regulations are laid later this year to make a further statement on an update on the delivery of the compensation scheme. But I know from my discussions with the community just how important the existing infected blood support scheme payments are to them. I recognise that many people, sadly, rely on these payments, and they are rightly keen to understand what the government's intentions are. And I want to provide reassurance to all those out there today that no immediate changes will be made to the support schemes. Payments will continue to be made at the same level until the 31st of March 2025, and they will not be deducted from any of these compensation awards. From the 1st of April 2025, any support scheme payments received will be counted towards a beneficiary's final compensation award. This will ensure parity between support scheme beneficiaries, regardless of whether they were the first or the last to have their compensation assessed by the Infected Blood Compensation Authority. And we will ensure that no one receives less in compensation than they would have received in support payments. Now, Mr. Speaker, I recognise that members of the infected blood community are still dying each week from their infections. And there may be people, indeed there will be people listening today, who are thinking to themselves that they may not live to receive compensation. So I want to address those concerns too. Today I'm announcing that the government will be making further interim payments ahead of the establishment of the full scheme. Payments of £210,000 will be made to living infected beneficiaries, those registered with existing infected blood support schemes, as well as those who register with a support scheme before the final scheme becomes operational, and the estates of those who pass away between now and payments being made. I know that time is of the essence, which is why I'm also pleased to say that they will be delivered within 90 days, starting in the summer, so that they can reach those who need it so urgently most. Now, Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I would like to turn to the matter of memorialisation. Many of those who were infected by contaminated blood or blood products have since died without knowing that their suffering and loss will be fully recognised, either in their lifetime or at all. The lives of most of those who have died remain unrecognised. And I note Sir Brian's recommendations on memorialisation across the UK. And the government will address those recommendations in detail as part of our wider response to this report. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I know that the whole House will want to join me in thanking Sir Brian and the inquiry for the work that they have done, and pay tribute to all those who have been caught up in this terrible tragedy and battled for justice for so long. Yesterday was a day of great humility for everyone implicated by this inquiry. And today, I can only hope, with the inquiry's report published, and with our firm commitment to compensate those touched by the scandal, the infected blood community knows that their cries for justice have been heard. Mr. Speaker, I commend this statement to the House.
Can I just say, lots of members want to get in, and all members will get in. I now come to the Shadow Secretary of State, Nick Thomas-Symonds.
Mr. Speaker, the infected blood scandal is one of the gravest injustices in our history and a profound moment of shame for the British state. The Leader of the Opposition apologised on behalf of the Labour governments of the past yesterday And the Prime Minister did the same on behalf of all governments and the country. And I join them today in saying a deep and heartfelt sorry. The scale of the horror that was uncovered by Sir Brian Langstaff's report almost defies belief. And that is why I pay tribute to the victims of this scandal who fought so hard for justice. We thank the charities, the remarkable campaigning work of my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, the father of the House, the journalist Caroline Wheeler, whose work and book, Death in the Blood, did so much to drive this issue forward. I also recognise the significance of the decision of the former Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead, in establishing the public inquiry. And I thank Sir Brian Langstaff and all his staff for their forensic work. And I also want to say thank you to the Minister for regularly briefing me and for his work in government ahead of today. Mr. Speaker, one of the most powerful conclusions in this report is an apology is only meaningful if it is accompanied by action. And it's that I turn to now. I welcome the further interim payments that the Minister has announced. And I repeat our commitment to work on a cross-party basis to help deliver the compensation scheme and get the money, the final money to victims as soon as possible. And I welcome the further details the Minister has given, including the appointment of the interim chair. And Sir Robert Francis already saying that he is seeking the views of the infected blood community is welcome. Does the Minister agree that continuing to hear that voice of victims going forward is absolutely crucial? I also welcome payments being made under the 5 heads of loss to the infected and the affected. And can the Minister confirm that estimates of the total costs have now been made and there will be no undue delay in those final payments reaching victims? Time is of the essence. One victim continues to die every 4 days. And on that, can the Minister set out some more detail on how the personal representatives of estates will be handled as part of the scheme? Can he also confirm the plans in place to trace people, additional people, who might be eligible for compensation? And could he also say a little more about when we can expect a progress report on Sir Brian Langstaff's other 11 recommendations beyond the establishment of the compensation body? And can I add too my support and the support of all on these benches to the consideration of appropriate and fitting memorials across the different parts of the UK, and indeed, as Sir Brian Langstaff recommends, for the victims who were treated at Trellor. On potential criminal charges, can the Minister ensure that all relevant evidence is made available for consideration by the prosecuting authorities and any other necessary support provided? Can I also say on Sir Brian Langstaff's findings on institutional defensiveness, of putting the reputation of people and protecting institutions above public service? This follows on from other scandals, such as Hillsborough and Horizon. It is why we must deliver a duty of candor and also the political leadership that we need to replace that culture of defensiveness with openness and transparency. Mr. Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff's report challenges all of us to make progress on his recommendations. That is what we must now come together to do. The victims deserve nothing less.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his collegiate tone and for the constructive approach he's taken throughout our conversations and in his response this afternoon. Look, I totally embrace the need to continue the dialogue with victims, and that's why I was very pleased that Sir Robert Francis agreed to take on this role, having done the study into the compensation. We have obviously met a number of times where I've explained to him what Jonathan Montgomery and the experts panel did, and I'm pleased that he's got to the point where he's sufficiently satisfied to move forward in this way. As the Prime Minister made clear yesterday, there is no restriction on the budget. Where we need to pay, we will pay. We will minimise delays. We will address the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff with respect to that speed and efficiency and removing as much complexity as possible. He asks about the representatives of different estates and tracing additional claimants. These will be matters that the Interim Chief Executive and the Interim Chair will look at very carefully. And what I envisage happening is, through the month of June, an exercise to engage meaningfully with representatives of the communities, to look at some of the assumptions in the work of that expert panel that will inform those regulations that we're duty-bound to bring to the House within 3 months of royal assent of the Victims and Prisoners Bill. I think some of the other matters with respect to the appropriate memorialisation and criminal charges and duty of candor, some of which progress is being made in different ways, are probably best left to some of my colleagues at a subsequent point. But as I said, I do anticipate that we'll have an early opportunity to discuss these in full in a debate soon after the Whitsun recess.
We come to Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
The House will understand my remarks will be subsidiary to the Right Honourable Lady for Hull North. It's 36 years since I was with the first of my friends who I knew had been infected, and it's 33 years since the person died. Friendships got fractured, families were changed forever. One of the points which I hope my honourable friend will put to his fellow ministers on health is whether those who are still infected in some way can have a kind of National Health Service passport. So when they go to get medical attention, they're not asked the same questions that my constituents were every time. How much you've been drinking, why is your liver in the way it is, and all the rest. It is important, I think, that those who are young in conditions should actually understand that if you see that there's a haemophilia or a whole blood infection, that you can take for granted a lot of things which you don't need to ask. That humanity, I think, needs to be spread. Can I also say to my honourable friend that I recognise that he is built on the work of our honourable friend, the member for Horsham. And if I can say in a cross-party way that Sue Gray, when she led the civil servants in that, I think deserves respect, as do her successors in the civil service who are putting things right. My last point is this. These are not lottery sums people are being awarded. In some way, they make up for some of the losses and they recognise some of the hurt. In some families, who may not have been used to having much money around, in fact, most of them have been used to having very little money because of the consequences of infections, they may need to have mediation services in case they don't agree. And it could be a good idea if Sir Robert or others could consider whether that could be made available in the same way that other people who suddenly come into some degree of money can get some kind of help, because families sometimes don't find it easy to decide how money should be shared.
I thank my right honourable friend for his comments, and I pay tribute to the work that he's done and the constructive way he's engaged with me over the last 6 months and obviously many years before. He makes the point about his friend and the stigma that has been attached to some of the conditions that some of the victims have had to endure. And obviously that's why in the Injury and Social Impact Awards that's reflected in the heads of loss that are reflected in the scheme. He makes some observations about how that better awareness of some of those conditions can be taken forward, and I will discuss that with my ministerial colleagues, and several of them from the Department of Health and Social Care are here today. He mentions my immediate predecessor, but I am very aware that a large number of Paymaster Generals, including one sat next to along from me today, have done an enormous amount of work to get us to this point. and of course many officials, including James Quinault, who has led the work latterly. So I do want to acknowledge that their contribution, this isn't about me. But I would say to him more broadly that he makes some very wise observations about the need to ensure that the communities that will be given very significant sums of money, rightly so, and in line with what they would be entitled if they went through a legal process, that the appropriate framework of support is in place to assist them through receiving this money in a way that isn't destructive to their lives.
SNP spokesperson Christie.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Yesterday, Mr Speaker, was a very emotional day for many of us. And I'm privileged that I was with constituents in the Central Hall yesterday, Cathy Young and her two fantastic daughters, Lisa and Nicola. And so I joined the Minister in paying great tribute to the infected blood community. When the infected blood community gave a standing ovation to Sir Brian Langstaff yesterday, I think that's a sight that will never, ever leave me, Mr Speaker. So can I echo the public gallery's reaction to the appointment of Sir Robert Francis? For my mind, that's an excellent appointment. And so could the Minister confirm that Sir Robert Francis, for example, will be able to meet the APPG and others in this House? Can he also, and he knows that I have raised this with him, can he guarantee that looking at the composition of the board of the Compensation Authority going forward, that will include representatives of the infected and affected, and that they will have that what we believe, the rightful representation on that board? Can I welcome the Minister's comments in relation to hepatitis B? This has always been, I think, one of the issues of contention. So can I ask the Minister to consider, some people with hepatitis B have been missing out on the existing schemes, and can he have a look for me to find a way that those with hepatitis B get access to the existing schemes? I know the Scottish Infected Blood Forum has asked him that question. Can I also just clarify in terms of interim payments that he mentioned the living, but so can I ask him if interim payments are going to be made to the estates of those who've sadly passed away? My penultimate question, Minister, is some people will raise eyebrows at the fact that the compensation, or the interim compensation, is less than those in the post office. So can he give some explanation as to why the 210,000 figure has been brought about today? I echo the comments made by the Shadow Minister in relation to looking at criminal charges and a Hillsborough law, and I very much welcome his comments on memorial. Does the Minister agree with me that there are two other lessons? The first lesson is that members of this House, regardless of political persuasion, can get together to deliver justice. And the second lesson is that those, like for example in the affected blood community, the key lesson for the general public is never ever give up in fighting injustice.
Minister.
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for, again, his engagement and the points he's made today. I mean, I was there yesterday for the 2 hours of Sir Brian Langstaff's presentation of his report, and it was a very moving moment for all of those who've suffered and waited for so long. I'm grateful for his endorsement of the appointment of Sir Robert Francis. It seemed to be welcomed in the gallery. And I recognise that what is absolutely critical, if this is to be successful, is that the communities need to be fully engaged, and the explanation of how this scheme has been constructed and any concerns around the wider support that's needed are interrogated fully before those regulations come back to the House. But throughout this, it's about reconciling speed and efficiency with consultation. And that's why it was done in the way that I have done it over the last few months. He makes a point about hepatitis B and access to the schemes. I'll be happy to correspond with him separately on that, because obviously there are lots of technical issues there. He asks about the amount of £210,000. You can see it's an irregular amount, because I was trying to get the maximum amount that could be universally paid to those who are infected and alive without any risk of paying the wrong amount. And that was the maximum that I was advised, and as quickly as I could. But what's really important is that we get to the examination of entitlements and get to what that balancing payment is and get that payment out as quickly as possible. This isn't a stalling tactic. It's trying to reconcile competing priorities of responsible stewardship of taxpayers' money whilst also trying to do it as quickly as possible for the most vulnerable community. With respect of the memorialisation, I think these are matters where I think there'll need to be wide engagement, and I wouldn't want to make binding commitments today. But I've said what I've said, and I think this will be a matter that myself or other ministers will return to in due course.
Chair of the Health Select Committee, Steve Bryan.
Thank you. Can I thank the Minister for what he said and how he said it? I know he, the Prime Minister, and particularly the Chancellor sat next to him, will make this right. Clearly, the majority of Sir Brian's recommendations are for the health and social care sector, and the Health Select Committee, which I chair, will play its part, working with the Secretary of State and NHS England, I see she's on the bench as well, to ensure that all the recommendations, unlike some previous accepted patient safety recommendations, are implemented. Can I just ask him about the 5 loss categories? They make every sense, and I note his 2 small refinements. But can I just ask him on the financial loss award, if it will reflect the reality for many infected blood victims that they cannot, just as one example, access life insurance? Will it reflect those elements of financial loss, please?
Minister.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for his comments, and I would also like to thank the Chancellor for his unwavering commitment to resolve this in a timely way, both when I was Chief Secretary and now in this role. With respect to the 5 loss categories, he makes a very legitimate point about a specific element of additional burdens, consequential of the conditions that people have. Now, this is a matter that will be no doubt raised by some in the communities, but the structure around injury, social impact, autonomy, care and financial loss, clearly with social impact and autonomy, they capture a range of unspecific, but a basket of goods, if you like, of things that people would have not been able to procure at the same cost. So I can't give him a specific answer on that, but Jonathan Montgomery and his team of experts have tried to do everything they can to look at the law, look what would be entitled in different circumstances, and give the best assessment. And that will be the sorts of conversations that will happen with the communities in the coming weeks.
Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Minister's statement today? I'm just reflecting on the fact that he's talked about those infected and affected being fully engaged, and I just wanted to gently remind him of the maxim, no decision about us without us, and the lack of transparency so far in the expert panel, and it's only today that we will learn the names of the people who've been advising the government. But can I also welcome the appointment of Sir Robert Francis as the interim chair of the infected blood body. Of course, it's worth reflecting on the fact that Sir Brian yesterday put in his report of the failure of government to respond to Sir Robert Francis's compensation framework document, which the leader of the House commissioned when she was a Paymaster General, and the government promised several times that they would respond to. That was never published. So I just wondered if the Paymaster General could just set out, because we've also not had a proper written response to the second interim report from Sir Brian last April, are all the recommendations, all 18, are they being accepted by the government? And if not, why not? And could he also just confirm how the government is going to ensure that the Compensation Authority is accountable directly to Parliament as recommended by the Infected Blood Inquiry?
Minister.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her observations and the engagement that we've had on an ongoing basis since I was appointed. I do take seriously what she says about no decision without full engagement. I made a decision in order to get to this point where we would, in principle, accept the recommendations of Sir Brian Langstaff, move forward with the independent expert panel. As I've said to her previously, I was always prepared to reveal the names of those individuals. I didn't want them to be distracted while they were doing urgent work to make progress quickly. Their names will be available shortly today. Sir Robert Francis and I had a number of conversations about the interaction between government and the expert group, the logic that I'd used to get to these heads of loss and to get to this scheme today. And I'm delighted that he is in a position where he's prepared to facilitate, in essence, the engagement with the communities. I've also been mindful of the principle of government managing public money, whilst also recognising Sir Brian's imperatives around setting an arm's length body that is arm's length from government in order to restore or generate some trust with a very, very vulnerable community. Reconciling those two has not been straightforward, but she asks about the accountability of the arm's length body. I think these are matters that will need to be discussed further with respect to the regulations that we have to lay before the House. But what I would say to her is that, yes, a number of my predecessors have done a lot of work on this. I am pleased that we've made significant progress, but there is an intense amount of work to be done to deliver this over the next 3 months, and I look forward to working constructively with her, as Sir Robert Francis does, to make sure that we get this to the right place as quickly as possible.
Chair of PACAC, Dame Jackie Doyle-Price.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. We've heard descriptions of institutional defensiveness today, but I think we should be very clear about what we're actually talking about. This was a grubby secret, kept secret by the Department of Health. The people who suffered as a consequence of this were treated as an inconvenience to be managed. And this flies in the face of what we are required to do in this House in terms of holding ministers accountable for what happens in their departments. We really do need to learn from this to improve how we behave and how we hold the executive to account in future. If we don't, this incident will shame us all and not just those who are directly responsible. So could I perhaps say to my right honourable friend that what we really need to look at now is make sure that we do properly establish a duty of candour for civil servants in the advice they give to ministers, and a requirement that ministers must satisfy themselves that they are giving appropriate challenge and consideration to the advice they're receiving, so that everyone involved in delivering services in future can be held directly responsible, and this place does not continue to be a charade.
Minister.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her comments, and I agree with her instinctive reaction to what Sir Brian says about the duty of candour. It will be for the government more widely to determine how we respond to that in a formal and coherent way. Now, my right honourable friend, the Chancellor, when he was in a previous role, moved quite a lot of things forward within the Department of Health, as I know the Honourable Lady knows. But I think it's important when somebody spends that amount of time coming to that depth of evaluation and a number of insights and recommendations, the government looks at it very carefully. But I do think that Sir Brian makes wise observations that we need to heed, listen to, and apply into the way that we do government in this country.
Christine Jolly.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. Can I echo the points that have been made about welcoming the statement today? It's been a long time coming. And for many of my constituents in Edinburgh West, as for many others, and their family and their friends, this is a very poignant day. There have been reassurances called for by organisations like Haemophilia Scotland that the recommendations will be adhered to in a way that perhaps they haven't been in the past. So would the Minister agree that having the involvement with various groups of affected and infected people will help to ensure that that happens?
Absolutely, I agree with the Honourable Lady. And when I went to Edinburgh, I was keen to meet a representative group of Scottish infected blood campaign organisations, and I did so. And I had a very candid conversation with them. I set out where we were as a government, what we were planning to do on this day at a high level. Those conversations need to continue. As I say, the immediate priority is under Sir Robert Francis's guidance. That engagement will continue through the month of June so that these regulations are informed by the wisdom, experience and views of those we're seeking to support.
Sir David Davis.
Thank you, Speaker. And I start by commending my constituency neighbour, the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, for her courage, determination and persistence in relentlessly pursuing this matter over the years. I wholeheartedly support her call for the rapid payment of compensation before any more sufferers die, and I know the Minister has that in mind. Now, the Prime Minister said that a travesty like this should never be allowed to happen again. And like the PACAC chairman, I think that rests on this whole question of the duty of candour that Sir Brian Langstoff recommended. And that means a legally enforceable duty of candour for the entire public service, not just some promise. And as it turns out, the Minister has in front of him the opportunity to do that. In front of the Lords, in report stage today, the Victims and Prisoners Bill has a clause imposing a duty of candour, but in a very limited way. Can he look at that clause and expand it to cover the whole of the public sector under all circumstances?
Minister.
Well, I defer to the right honourable gentleman's considerable experience and wisdom on many matters. I do recognise his point, but I do think to move on this matter in this way, in this short time frame, would not be the right step. But I do think that it would be right for us to urgently engage with him and the committee and others to ensure that the government comes up with the right complete response to deal with a very sensible point that Sir Brian has made.
Ian Byrne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to pay tribute to my constituents whose lives have changed forever and the many campaigners who have fought for so many years for truth and justice affected by this scandal. From Hillsborough to the post office to the infected blood scandal and many, many more. We have watched states and institutions cover up wrongdoing and blame the innocent with no accountability. Minister, how long do we have to wait for those in this place to finally act and rebalance the scales of justice and to deliver a full Hillsborough law? Yesterday's event showed how necessary that law is to begin to end the culture of cover-ups that is shamefully hardwired into our institutions.
Well, I very much respect the points he's made about the Hillsborough. I mean, I'm not able to answer his question specifically on that today. My remarks are around the compensation scheme, but I think there are a number of points made about the incidence of public inquiries on a range of issues, what that says about our state and the failure of it in different ways. And as the Honourable Gentleman says, the considerable effort required that should never have been required by individuals to apprehend the state for what has happened. These are wider matters that we will need to come to terms with, but I don't think I'll be able to do justice to his remarks today.
Caroline Knowles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate that today's statement is about compensation, but there was no opportunity yesterday nor much today to ask specifically about Lord Mayor Trellor College in Hampshire. My constituent, Mike Webster, sent his son Gary, a constituent of my honourable friend, the member for Eastleigh, to Trellor's back in the late 70s and early 80s. And he wrote to me last month saying how distraught he was that that school is now trying to paint itself as a victim when in fact we know it was in receipt of funds to conduct experiments on children. Can my right honourable friend give me some assurance from the dispatch box that the government is considering very carefully how the Helsinki Declaration may have been breached and some guidance as to what future steps may be taken?
Okay, one more. Minister.
The right honourable lady very eloquently makes a very, very important point. And I met with, in the course of my engagement, a number of former pupils from Trellor's school. And I believe that Sir Robert, in his report, one full volume pertains to what happened there, where so many individuals underwent medical treatment that was not envisaged by their parents and where consent appears not to have been secured. This is a massive aspect of the work of Sir Brian Langstoff, and the government will need to examine it very carefully and the implications for who is culpable and how we should most appropriately respond to avoid anything like that happening again. And I hope what I've said today with respect to compensation will give some modest measure of comfort to those that I met and those like them who aren't here today.
Jessica Moore.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. There aren't words enough to pay tribute to all those campaigners infected and affected, and they include my constituent Lynn, who lost Bill, the Smiths, and I also pay tribute to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull North, and journalists like Caroline Wheeler. The Smiths lost Colin, aged just 7 years old, to AIDS, having been given infected blood from Arkansas prison at 10 months old. And we now know from the inquiry that risks of giving this blood were known. Lynn and the Smiths want sorry to turn into something today for those who die every week. So on their behalf, can I say to the Minister today, make sure we have a proper timeline for this and that we stick to it, implement the recommendations as fast as possible, put the victims at the heart of the decision-making, and no more delays. This group of people have waited far too long and have been through far too much already. And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Smiths also want their son to have his name back, although they have always made sure that we have never forgotten it. So can I say it today? Colin John Smith.
Minister.
Thank you. The Honourable Lady makes a moving tribute to her constituents, and I can assure her that the Government has heard the pleas that have been made, and we have set out today a clear timetable on the journey to the regulations. I will update the House later in the early autumn with the Speaker's permission on where we've got to on then the timeline for further detail, subject to the advice of the Interim CEO and the Interim Chair. She makes the point about stigma as well, which is obviously a massive, massive part of this for so many that I met and for her constituents and the Smith family. We recognise that as part of the scheme, but I think the memorialisation process must also recognise particularly those who were so badly stigmatised in the 80s and 90s.
Paul Bristow.
Speaker, I know from meeting some of the affected community in Peterborough, the Minister talked about stigma. I heard about the discrimination that they faced and also a lack of trust in public institutions many of the community faces. This all leaves a very long legacy. With this in mind, how confident is he that this scheme will benefit or will affect everyone infected and anyone who's been infected, will capture everybody despite this long legacy? And how confident is he that everyone who should be compensated will come forward?
Minister.
I thank the honourable gentleman for his question. I am confident that this scheme will work. It will work as quickly as it possibly can. I mentioned the interim payments of $210,000 today to the infected who are alive. But the speed with which we process applications of affected and infected is very much what is on my mind as we've set up this shadow ALB. And I will be continuing to work with my officials to do everything we can to move the timeline from the right to the left, conscious of how long people have waited for so long.
Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. First of all, can I welcome the fact that the Minister has moved so quickly. The sorrow expressed yesterday had to be translated into action, and the fact that the authority has been set up, the chairman who will have the confidence of the victims has been established, and payments will be made quickly, at least interim payments made quickly, is good. But for people like my constituent Trevor Marston, who was used as an experiment by people who described children as cheaper than chimps and more readily available, justice will only be given when those who cynically used their position, that they devised experiments, denied that they were happening, then tried to destroy the evidence, then defend their actions. Those people only have justice when the elite within the civil service and the professionals who cynically abuse their position know that they will face criminal charges, because that's what they are, and face criminal charges, and that this government will make sure that all of the evidence is made available so that they can be brought to justice.
Minister.
The right honourable gentleman makes a very powerful representation on behalf of Trevor Marsham and more generally with respect to some of the conclusions that Sir Brian has made in his remarks. What happened was truly shameful with respect to experimentation. As he will be aware, today I am speaking to the issue of compensation, but it is an urgent matter to really isolate who knew what when, take that from the report and establish what courses of action in different ways across the range of issues we've had raised here in the House today, what is the most appropriate way to deal with all of them.
Sir Jeremy Wright.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome what my right honourable friend has set out, and welcome in particular the efforts that he and his predecessors have clearly made to remove friction from the process of getting the victims of this unforgivable episode the compensation they clearly deserve. But he will recognise that as the system beds down and begins to operate, there is always the risk of that friction creeping back in. And can he make sure that he and his ministerial colleagues keep their eyes on this process, work with Sir Robert Francis to make sure that this process continues to be without friction, so that people continue to be able to easily access the compensation they need?
Minister.
Absolutely. My right honourable friend makes a very wise point. The need to swiftly expedite payments in full to as many qualifying people as possible is the imperative that has guided me to this point, and it will be the imperative that Sir Robert will take forward in his conversations. We must not introduce unnecessary complexity to establish people's qualification to receive a payment when that is unnecessary. So there is a tension, but we've got to actually resolve it to get these payments out. And that's why we will need to, and the arm's length body will need to prioritise too, particularly around those groups that are infected alive and those that are suffering most, many of whom I met recently.
Dame Angela Riedel.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Does the Minister understand that as well as a duty of candour, we really need, as my right honourable friend, the member for Garston and Hale Wood, has consistently put before this House, a public advocate to make certain that victims in future of scandals such as this have somebody to look after them and take them through processes, and that would stop this happening ever again. Can he say something about when he expects all of the payments to have been made? He's talked about an interim scheme which goes on to the end of this financial year, and then he's talking about the full payments being made going further forward. When is his deadline for getting this done?
Minister.
I thank the honourable lady for a question. She talks about the public advocate. I am not in a position to respond to that today, but it's clearly one option that is available, and I think it will be part of the wider response to the report. To be clear, the interim payments of £210,000 to the infected alive that I've announced today will be paid within 90 days starting in the summer. But the full payments will begin by the end of the year. But I'm constrained somewhat because we're setting up an arm's length body. Now, there is an interim chief executive, and I think there'll be 20 people employed in this organisation by the end of next week. But I can't account for the processes and the way it will be established, and therefore how quickly. But everything I've said to David Foley, who is the interim chief executive, is designed to impress on him the need for speed to expedite as many of these claims as quickly as possible in full.
Kit Malthouse.
Mr. Speaker, can I commend the Minister on his statement? I know from our conversations how seriously he takes his moral duty on this issue. But I also know from the work done at the Cabinet Office in the summer of 2022 in getting the first interim payments out that one of the most fraught areas of consideration will be wider eligibility. And that's not just a function of complexity, it's also a function of capacity. Now, the Minister mentioned that the arm's length body will have 20 employees in the next couple of weeks. But could he just reassure the House that if Sir Robert Francis comes back in a few months' time and said, in order to make quick decisions, I need more capacity and therefore more people, there will be no quibbling on adequate resource in this organisation to fulfil the Minister's rightly identified priority of getting this money out as quickly as possible to as many people as possible.
Minister.
I thank my right honourable friend for his observations, and I thank him for what he did when he was in office. to bring forward interim payments and to make progress. I mean, he's right with respect to the business case for the arm's length body and the plans for the number of people needed to be employed in it. I expect Sir Robert and the interim chief executive to be iteratively working up plans to expedite this as quickly as possible and to assert what they need in terms of resourcing to make it deliver as quickly as possible. And I'll do everything I can to prioritise swift delivery in the decisions that I make.
Dr. Philippa Whitford.
Hear, hear. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The timeline that is in Sir Brian's report highlights the litany of failures, delays and cover-ups over decades that actually resulted in even more patients being exposed to hepatitis C and HIV. While several countries accepted liability and set up compensation schemes in the mid-90s, UK victims have had to spend another 30 years of their lives not just dealing with ill health, but fighting for justice. Now, I welcome the vast majority of what the Minister has announced this morning, and I'm sure everyone across the House does. But the members of the infected blood community who are here this morning will be really concerned to hear his comments that imply a threat to the ongoing support payments. So does he accept it's not just a matter of saying the infected blood community will be involved in the compensation scheme, but will their wishes be listened to?
Hear, hear. Absolutely they will. And when I was in Edinburgh, I was very keen to ensure, and I had long conversations about the need to understand the integration of the existing infected blood scheme, support schemes, which present in a different way and offer meaningful psychological and other support services to those communities in different parts of the United Kingdom. As two parts of the heads of loss, we're talking about past and future care costs and loss of income, past and future. And so we're consolidating those into a lump sum, but I have made the absolute commitment that nobody will be worse off. There are a couple of categories where there is potential risk of that, and we will make sure that nobody will be worse off. But the sensitivity in the delivery of this scheme, in terms that the various communities across the United Kingdom will be comfortable with, is at the top of my mind and is going to be instrumental in determining the regulations that are formed that guides this into law in the next few months.
Sir Robert Buckland.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I commend my right honourable friend for his statement and indeed for the tone the government has taken with regard to this most grave scandal. It's striking, isn't it, that the chair of the inquiry, Sir Brian Langstaff, has said that his job isn't yet done and that he will only regard his terms of reference as fulfilled when the government responds within a period of 12 months on his recommendations. And importantly, he will only regard his job done if he feels that there's nothing more that he can do in order to prevent delay. Bearing in mind the government has to respond to the second interim report and indeed now this final report, can my right honourable friend assure me and this House and indeed the wider public that he and the government will do everything they can to ensure that Sir Brian's role is fulfilled as swiftly as possible?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Absolutely, I can reassure him of that. Today's announcements on compensation and the documents that will flow through will be a substantive response to meet the expectations of many in the communities, and the formalisation of those responses will be something I will consider very carefully to bring clarity to the matter.
Kevin Jones.
Thank you. Could I put on record the thanks, I think, of all of us to the campaigners, but also to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull. As someone who campaigned for many years on postmasters, I know how lonely it is at times when you're taking on the state and no one believes you. Can I welcome what the Paymaster General has announced today in terms of compensation scheme based on tariffs? But can I tell him from my experience as a member of the Post Office Horizon Advisory Board that the big work now starts in terms of agreeing those levels of those tariffs. And can I ask him whether or not the government will pay individual claimants' legal bills, because they will need some legal advice on that. And can I also just echo what the Father of the House said earlier on? A lot of money is going to be paid out here to people. You will get unscrupulous individuals trying to prey on people. Can I suggest that we ensure that they get financial advice and support when those payments are made?
Minister.
Well, not for the first time. The honourable gentleman makes some very wise points, and I'm grateful to him for doing so. And I accept a number of the points he's made with respect to the concern around tariffs. These tariffs have not been set up with financial constraints. They've been set up with the input of a range of experts to make a judgment on what would be appropriate versus what would be legally entitled to. What now needs to happen is that the assumptions behind those bandings, those severity bandings, etc., need to be explained and scrutinised, and that's what is going to happen. He makes a very reasonable point about the concern around unscrupulous people claiming, and again, and also, so the issue there really is, how do you put safeguards in place while expediting for all of those quickly who are qualified? He makes a very reasonable point about the professional support of lawyers and financial advisors, which is also something at the top of my mind, learning from some of the other scandals that I was familiar with in my previous role as Economic Secretary, and I will take those to heart in the future.
Dr. Kieran Mullen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want to begin by paying tribute to my constituent, Paul Bloor, for his campaigning. Paul started at Trellor College in 1974 and was infected with hepatitis C from contaminated blood products. I regret that I personally hadn't grasped the full horrendousness of what has gone on, and I thank Sir Brian for ensuring that we all now do understand. Paul welcomes compensation, but what he asked me to raise with the Minister was about accountability and what work is now being done to ensure that we can now pursue any avenues of personal accountability for those that deserve to have their conduct looked at.
Minister.
Well, I can totally understand why Paul would want that point raised. I mean, these matters go beyond my brief on compensation. I think the whole House will recognise this is an urgent matter that other ministers and other departments will need to address properly and in full. I hope that the debate after Whitsun will give us an opportunity to really open up into all of those matters as a House, and therefore for the government to respond appropriately as quickly as possible. Some of the things that happened were completely against the values of the institutions that those individuals were part of. We need to really fully examine it and come to terms with it and make sure it can never happen again.
Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Can we accept that institutional defensiveness has not gone away and will only go away when we in this House act to make it go away? For the past few years, I've been working with constituents who were the victims of a Ponzi scheme. They lost millions of pounds. They were failed repeatedly by first the FSA and the FCA. They have been left out of pocket to the tune of almost £2 million in legal fees, in which the FCA has no apparent interest. Would he meet with me and other honourable members who have affected constituents and some of the victims themselves to see what can be done to deliver for them the good intentions that he has expressed today?
Minister.
Well, thank you. I'm very sorry to hear about his constituents, and if there's a matter related to the FCA, I know from my prior experience that the member for Hitchin and Harpington is best placed, the current Economic Secretary, to address that. I do understand the problem of the jurisdiction of the FCA, particularly with unregulated activities, but I really don't think I'd be able to help him. I think he should address that question very respectfully to my colleague in the Treasury.
Chloe Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'm glad that my right honourable friend the Minister has done a diligent job here, reflective of his attitude to the overall need and the gravest of situations here. However, it all ought to have been done earlier, and I hold in mind my former constituent Annie Walker, who died in 2016, and I wish she had been able to see this before she did. She told me she was tired of having to keep campaigning. I also have in mind current constituent, who I will not name, but who I work with regularly on this, and he has asked me particularly to make the point here today about the care schemes, the support schemes that are, as per the Minister's statement, due to change. He and I would be very grateful for as much clarity as possible on that. I think that will be needed by many involved. And may I finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, urge the Minister and his colleagues in government to bring forward those regulations as soon as possible. If I understand it correctly, Sir Robert Francis may be taking a number of weeks. He's mentioned the month of June, and we heard the figure of 5 weeks. So can I take it that we may see those regulations in July, which would allow, I hope, all members of this House, not just a select committee of this House, selected committee of this House, to do its job on scrutinising those regulations and get the job done as fast as possible.
Minister.
I thank the right honourable lady for